Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it to water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from his bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things being done by him. This is the gospel of the Lord. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the service, as you look around, you'll notice that things are definitely starting to look a little different around here as we've begun and continue the process of packing and preparing for our move to Fennel. This has included going through many drawers and closets and cupboards, items that have accumulated over the past 70 years, and as these items are uncovered from the past, new memories and reflections are brought to mind. As I was sorting through my office, I found notes from my time when I was doing my student chaplaincy placement at a hospital in Barrie. And in those notes, each day we had to do reflections on our experience. And I had a note from one day when I was having lunch with a colleague, and he mentioned that he had gone to visit a patient at the hospital. We'll call her Grace. He had gone to visit Grace. And I had noted that in that moment, I felt upset because Grace, in my mind, was my patient. I had visited her over the past week, had seen her multiple times, had been given responsibility, had taken responsibility for her spiritual well-being in this hospital, and I wanted to take credit for that work. So my colleague hadn't done anything wrong by seeing Grace that morning, but I still found myself upset, like he had taken something away from me. And so with that story in mind and reflecting on today's gospel reading, I can say that I resonate with the synagogue leader who is indignant toward Jesus. He's worked hard in the synagogue, developing relationships with those who attend, teaching, ensuring that the community is strengthened, and he is confident that the law is being followed in that space and that they are doing God's will. But on this day, yet again, Jesus is present and he is teaching. We're told that he is in the synagogue on the Sabbath and a woman appears. She's bent over, has been this way for 18 years, unable to look up. Scholar Emily Towns describes the woman in this way. For 18 years, this unnamed woman must strain to see the sun, the sky, and the stars. For 18 years, she has become accustomed to looking down or just slightly ahead, but never upward without difficulty. For 18 years, her world has been one of turning from side to side to see what those who stand upright can see with just a glance. She is used to this, and no one questions her fate. But on this day, while Jesus is teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath, Jesus questions her fate. He calls her over, lays on hands, heals her, and she begins praising God. And yet again, as we hear in the Gospels, Jesus has overstayed his welcome. The leader of the synagogue becomes indignant, angry beyond reason, telling the crowds that they must come back on the days that are designated for work, not on the Sabbath day, because this is a day of rest, not a day of healing. One of his tasks is to make sure that the rules of the law are being followed, and he knows the rules. The Sabbath is for rest, not for work. The synagogue leader knows his scripture. He is not able to recognize the extraordinary circumstance which has presented itself. And he takes ownership of the people, of the synagogue, and of God's very presence in that space, and makes the story about himself. It's a trap that's all too easy for those who have been put in a position of power or responsibility, or those that carry it because of the privilege they have within society. For myself, like the synagogue leader, I considered Grace, that patient, my responsibility because I had visited her. It was my task to follow up with her, not anyone else's. Her needs would be met by me when I was ready and when I could go there on my schedule and in my way. As I reflected on that moment, it had become all about me doing something for my benefit, forgetting that the entire reason I was at the hospital was to work for the benefit of others. That my calling as a chaplain was to recognize and help people recognize that God was meeting them in their time of need, but that this work is done by multiple people, as a team in different ways and on different visits. I had taken on too much of this work and made it personal. I wanted the title that came with that of helper, rather than to see people be helped. And this can happen in other areas of our culture where people who help others forget why they are doing it, for whom they are doing it. Instead of raising somebody up, instead of curing the ill woman, it becomes an act of personal recognition. It happens in politics as leaders show up to photo ops in times of tragedy, appearing to offer support to victims when their policies that they've put in place may actually have been what have led to this situation. Or more recently in the news, we hear of business leaders and politicians adjusting expectations for how often workers need to come into the office so that they can be seen at work rather than just doing their work. Leaders can easily fall into this trap of acting for their visibility rather than for the benefit of others. Now, Jesus does happen to draw attention to himself, but his healing, his focus, it always remains on the one in need. He provides an example for how help can be given. You notice a problem, you deal directly with the one who is suffering, and then you let them respond. And we are told that the woman does respond. She stands up straight and she praises God. Her voice is the one that carries over the community. This short passage demonstrates so much about how Luke understands Jesus' ministry and the way that God's kingdom becomes present in the world. I want to identify three key points here from this passage. First, you just show up. The request does not come from the woman for healing. Jesus just does it. But she has shown up on this day. She doesn't come in and declare her faith. Jesus doesn't test it, but she does show up. Now, there are questions that scholars ask. Has she been allowed into the synagogue before? The text says she has a spirit, and so she would probably be considered unclean and unwelcome in that space. But when Jesus is there, just by coming into the building, she has declared her intention, has demonstrated her boldness, not by her words, but just by showing up in that time. Second, God's kingdom becoming present in the world is about liberation. The leaders of the synagogue state that Jesus shouldn't heal on the Sabbath because it's a day of rest. But Jesus turns that around, remembering that the Sabbath rest is about remembering Israel's freedom and liberation from Egypt. The ox and the donkey are liberated on the Sabbath, given water when they need it. So then how can a person who has been and suffered for 18 years be denied this same liberation on the Sabbath? God's purpose is liberation. and God's purpose is present in Jesus' mission. If liberation from Satan's bounds is God's purpose for today, then that is also Jesus' mission, and this liberation will happen today, on the Sabbath, without waiting. I'm reminded again that this idea of liberation is scary, is a hazard to those in power. As I had that image that we see on the screen, I chose that carving. It's called Dancing Woman. It's a carving that is recommended for today. It's about this woman, the gospel reading about a woman who is released, who is freed, who can now dance and stand upright. But Thomas gave me a bit more information about the backstory behind that carving. It's done by Ernst Barlach, a German carver. And during the Nazi regime, his work was called degenerate. He's considered one of the degenerate artists. And the carvings were put aside, unable to be seen because, I think, of the liberation they showed. Liberation, freedom, the opportunity to be seen by God, to be present, to dance, is a hazard and is a danger to those who have power. The third thing we learn from today's gospel is that praise and rejoicing is the appropriate response to this liberation. Again, Jesus doesn't take attention away from the woman. He calls her forward, and when she is healed, she becomes the center of attention, praising God. The person who hasn't been recognized, who has been ignored for 18 years, is now the leader of this congregation. And as Jesus verbally spars with the synagogue leader, the crowd ends up rejoicing at all that God has done. This is the one time in Luke's gospel that the crowd is said to rejoice. They have followed Jesus, they have observed him, they have welcomed him, they have discussed his works, but until now they have never rejoiced until this woman is released from her suffering. Like the woman, we find hope in this story. That we show up, and not through our qualities or our talents, but just by showing up, God heals. Jesus sees us, and Jesus calls us out of the crowds. And when we are called, our hope is that liberation will ensue. So my reminder to you is that the time is now, that Jesus is ready to meet you today. In our confessions, in our prayers, in our praise, Jesus meets us today. And in the healing we receive through that confession, through the response to our prayers, through communion, we are given a voice to praise and a voice to lift up others to help them find their voices. God is at work in the world, reaching out to people, inviting them forward. And we are asked to join in that calling, to make God's beckoning present to the world. From what will you be liberated today? How will you rejoice? Jesus has seen you in the crowd. He has seen you in the crowd and called you out, ready to heal you from that which holds you down. May you feel that healing presence, and may your freedom lead to a timely response, helping others to see that God is calling them to liberation and to praise. Amen.